All right, let's jump right into this. We're taking a deep dive today into a political clash that's really gone way beyond typical Washington sparring. The sources you've put before us, they detail this escalating feud between former President Donald Trump and, well, the incredibly influential billionaire Elon Musk.
Yeah, and what's striking in this material is how it's not just, talk. This feud, it's become a real force.
A powerful force, yeah, directly impacting Musk's business empire, especially giants like Tesla and SpaceX. And it's sending some serious tremors across the market, the political landscape, too.
It really is a collision. You've got two figures who command immense attention, and like you said, the material clearly shows their personal and political conflict. It's translated alarmingly quickly into tangible, high-stakes business consequences.
Absolutely. So our mission here in this deep dive is to really unpack this stack of sources, the articles, the research, the reports you've gathered. We want to understand the real roots of this conflict.
Where did it start?
Exactly. And the very specific, sometimes surprising ways it's hitting these massive companies and the broader economy too, and what it could possibly mean going forward.
So we'll pull out the key nuggets, the important facts, the details that help you, the listener, understand what's truly going on here.
Perfect. We'll trace how this rivalry evolved, zero in on the policies that really, ignited the fire.
And then break down the concrete effects, the financial side, the operational impacts reported across Musk's ventures.
Okay. So let's start at the beginning, because if you think back, there was a moment where these two didn't seem entirely opposed, right?
Yeah.
The sources mention an initial alignment.
They do, yeah. Early on, there was apparently some alignment, particularly around themes like deregulation and a certain kind of industrial nationalism, ideas about cutting red tape to boost American manufacturing, tech innovation.
Right. Musk even served on a couple of Trump's advisory councils briefly.
That's right. So they weren't always adversaries.
So what shifted things? What caused the divergence the sources talk about?
Well, the material seems to point to 2024 and then into early 2025. Musk started publicly positioning himself as more of a, political independent, advocating for something the sources call a moderate technocracy.
A moderate technocracy, okay.
And he became, increasingly vocal, criticizing specific proposed Trump policies.
And which specific policies became the flashpoints there?
Primarily proposals aimed at rolling back climate initiatives and, crucially, policies that would discourage electric vehicles. Musk's public criticism of those ideas seems to have been a significant turning point.
And Trump's counterattack was, true to form, pretty direct, personal even.
Very much so. He went from maybe general criticism or ignoring Musk to targeting him directly, by name, in rallies, statements.
What was the line?
He directly attacked Musk's business model, called him a subsidy billionaire who hates America First jobs.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a framing, right? Designed to undermine that image of Musk as a self-made innovator by pointing to all the government support his companies have received over the years.
Okay, so you have this initial kind of fragile alignment, then the political split driven by policy disagreements, and then Trump's really pointed personal attacks. But the sources identify one specific thing as the trigger. This proposed one big, beautiful bill. Tell us about that.
Right. This is where the conflict apparently escalated dramatically because it directly targeted the financial lifeblood of Musk's main companies. The sources detail key parts of this proposed legislation, parts that would significantly hit green energy and tech funding.
What were the specifics? How would it impact them?
Well, the bill proposed getting rid of federal EV tax credits, like that significant $7,500 credit a lot of buyers get now.
Okay, taking that away.
And it also suggested imposing completely new federal road usage fees, specifically on electric vehicles.
So a double whammy, taking away the incentive and adding a penalty just for EVs.
Exactly, a clear disincentive targeting EVs directly.
And where was that funding supposed to go instead? Redirected somewhere else?
The proposal involved redirecting existing space and innovation subsidies, the kind of funding SpaceX relies on heavily towards defense, and notably towards fossil fuel initiatives.
That seems like a very direct policy move, underscoring the political fight here.
It does seem that way.
You can really see how those specific proposals would land with just direct force on Tesla and SpaceX.
Yeah.
Let's focus on Tesla first. The sources reported immediate, pretty dramatic financial pressure, didn't they?
Oh, they did. The market reaction was swift and severe. The sources highlight June 5th, 2025. That was a key date. Right after the details of this feud escalating and the proposed bill became widely known, Tesla shares dropped a remarkable 14.2% in a single day.
14.2%. That is a massive swing for a company that size. What did that mean in actual market value?
That one-day drop wiped out over $150 billion in Tesla's market cap.
Oof, $150 billion.
Yeah, and the sources note analysts quickly attributed the sharp decline directly to worries about losing that $7,500 federal EV credit, plus the risk to regulatory credit trading.
Okay, that brings us to what the sources call the policy risk for Tesla. Beyond just the stock market freaking out, how does removing that $7,500 credit actually impact the business itself?
Well, the source material explains that without that federal incentive, the average affordability of a Tesla for U.S. buyers drops pretty significantly, actually, by around 10% to 12%, according to their analysis.
10 to 12%. That's a non-trivial price hike for potential customers, isn't it?
Not at all. And you mentioned regulatory credit trading.
Right. Can you briefly explain what that is and why losing it matters so much to Tesla's bottom line?
Sure. So Tesla earns these credits simply because they produce zero-emission vehicles. They don't need them all themselves, so they can sell the extras to other automakers. You know, the ones who aren't meeting emission standards and need the credits to comply.
Ah, okay. So it's like a side business for them.
And a profitable one for years. The sources estimate that losing both the direct incentives and this credit trading market could hit Tesla's annual profits by up to $3 billion.
Wow. Up to $3 billion. So it's hitting them from multiple angles, making cars less affordable for buyers and cutting into a major profit source. What about reputation? Beyond the pure financials.
That's also a factor the sources dig into. This whole political fight has fueled a kind of cultural backlash. You saw movements like hashtag Tesla Takedown gaining some traction, calling for boycotts.
And what's the core accusation there?
It's that Musk is profiteering, that he's benefited hugely from federal subsidies and government support for years, but now he's attacking the very political institutions that, provided that support.
The narrative is basically him biting the hand that fed him, so to speak.
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay, let's shift gears to SpaceX. Very different business, operates in a different space, obviously, but maybe even more reliant on the government. How's this feud hitting them?
Well, SpaceX has a very significant dependency on federal contracts. The sources state that roughly 0% of SpaceX's current revenue stream comes from contracts with NASA and the Department of Defense.
60%. Okay. That makes any threat to those contracts absolutely critical for them.
Precisely. And the source material highlights that Trump-allied legislators in Congress are actively pushing to review these contracts, maybe even cancel them.
On what grounds?
Well, they frame it in terms of national security concerns, but the sources make it pretty clear the political motivation is a significant driver here.
Right. And Musk himself engaged in some, let's call it retaliation talk. That really cranked up the tension, didn't he?
He did, yeah. There was that moment that grabbed all the headlines, he tweeted, and then quickly deleted it, a threat to basically decommission the Dragon spacecraft.
The Dragon. That's the capsule that takes U.S. astronauts to the International Space Station, right? What would decommissioning it actually mean, according to the sources?
NASA insiders quoted in the sources warned it would cause major disruption, potentially delaying ISS logistics, critical Artemis lunar missions by maybe 6 to 12 months.
So it shows the strategic leverage Musk has, but also, wow, the significant risk he was signaling he might be willing to take.
Exactly. It really underscores the strategic exposure for SpaceX.
What specific projects are highlighted as being particularly vulnerable right now?
Key projects like Starshield, that's the satellite constellation designed for government and military use, and various government deployments of Starlink services, they're now reportedly under review.
Under review.
And the sources point out there's a projected $22 billion pipeline of future federal contracts that could be put at risk by this ongoing political friction.
$22 billion. That's a massive amount of potential future revenue just hanging in the balance because of this political fight. It's not just Tesla's consumer market, it's SpaceX's core government customer base. Are his other ventures feeling the heat too, according to these sources?
Briefly, yes. They are reportedly also caught in the crossfire. Like xAI, his artificial intelligence company, it's apparently facing increased regulatory scrutiny.
And specifically around its AI model, TruthGPT.
Yeah. The sources suggest that Trump-backed platforms are actively lobbying for regulatory restrictions, particularly around things like content moderation policies. Restrictions that could hinder xAI and TruthGPT's development, or maybe its ability to integrate into broader platforms.
So the implication is they see it as a potential competitor, or maybe ideologically misaligned.
That seems to be the angle, yeah. in a landscape where different platforms are definitely vying for influence, control of information.
Makes sense. What about Neuralink, the
Yeah.
brain-computer interface company?
Neuralink, too, reportedly facing bureaucratic slowdowns. The sources point to a Trump-appointed FDA advisory panel. Apparently, it seems to be delaying approval for their next phase of human trials, citing the need for further bioethical review.
Which could significantly slow down their critical development timeline.
Absolutely.
So it really seems like no corner of his empire is entirely insulated from this. Okay, let's broaden the lens now. What about the implications beyond just Musk's companies? How is this impacting the wider market, the political landscape, based on the sources?
Well, what's particularly interesting here is that it's not just a one-way street. The impact isn't only on Musk. The sources mention that Trump Media and Technology Group trading under DJT also saw an 8% drop after the feud escalated.
Huh. So the market sees mutual risk here. It's not just Musk who could get hurt in this standoff. How's Wall Street reacting more broadly to this sort of unique situation?
Investors, especially the big institutional players, hedge funds, they're reportedly reevaluating their exposure, looking at companies with significant government ties or ones sensitive to policy shifts, not just Musk's, and really assessing political sensitivity as a new, heightened risk factor.
So political risk is becoming a bigger variable in their calculations.
Definitely. The sources even cite a Goldman Sachs note cautioning that this specific standoff could actually evolve into a systemic headwind for the entire tech market.
A systemic headwind. Wow. That suggests this isn't just a one-off feud, but maybe signals a new category of political risk that could hit a whole range of companies.
It could, yeah.
And what about the cultural side? Public reaction. How are people processing this clash of titans?
Well, as you might expect, the conflict has deeply polarized public opinion. It really reflects the broader divisions in the country. The sources note that pro-Trump groups have actively called for boycotts of Tesla, other Musk products, seeing him as an adversary now.
Right. And on the other side, Musk isn't exactly universally beloved of the progressives either, is he?
Exactly. That's the complicated dynamic the sources highlight. Many people who are critical of Musk for, various reasons, his politics, labor practices, whatever, they find themselves in an awkward spot.
How so?
Well, while they obviously oppose Trump, they're hesitant to offer any perceived support for Musk or his companies. Even when those companies are being targeted by someone they also oppose, it creates this kind of political no man's land around his brand.
Yeah, that really shows how deep the political lines are drawn, when even having a common opponent doesn't necessarily create alignment. So, looking ahead now, based on the source material, what are the potential future paths? How might this conflict play out? What scenarios do they lay out?
The sources map out a few potential scenarios with different probabilities attached. The first one they mention is detente and compromise.
Okay, detente. What's the likelihood on that, and what would it actually look like?
It's assigned a medium likelihood, and this scenario basically involves the rhetoric calming down. Maybe some concessions are made, perhaps Tesla gets to keep partial subsidies, crucial SpaceX contracts are ultimately preserved or reinstated without major damage, a de-escalation.
Okay, a medium chance of things cooling off. What's the next possibility?
But the sources rate prolonged conflict as having a high likelihood.
High likelihood. Okay,
Yeah.
that sounds more probable then. What does that mean for Musk's ventures?
It implies the status quo continues or worsens. Regulatory bottlenecks, legislative pressure stays intense, contract reviews persist. In this scenario, the sources suggest Musk would likely accelerate a strategic pivot towards international markets, meaning deepening partnerships with, say, the EU Space Agency, or pursuing more manufacturing and contracts in places like Japan or India.
Essentially actively trying to reduce dependency on what's become a potentially hostile U.S. political environment.
Exactly, trying to de-risk from U.S. politics.
Okay, and the third scenario?
That's corporate retaliation. The sources assign this a low likelihood.
Low likelihood. What would that actually involve?
This would mean Musk using his considerable resources, his platforms, to actively support opposition candidates, or maybe anti-Trump tech platform.
And why is that seen as low likelihood?
Because, according to the sources, it carries a very high risk of intensifying the political retaliation against his companies. To a degree, that could be far more damaging than the current situation. Basically, poking the bear could be catastrophic.
Right, so the most probable path, according to this analysis, is this kind of grinding, prolonged conflict, one that forces strategic adaptation, rather than a clean ceasefire or an aggressive counterattack. Given that high likelihood of ongoing conflict, what strategic advice do the sources offer? How should these ventures navigate this?
Well, the core advice presented in the sources really centers on reducing vulnerability, reducing exposure to this new level of U.S. political risk. One key recommendation is to diversify revenue
Okay, and how specifically?
by actively reducing that dependency on U.S. government contracts we talked about. So, pursuing deeper partnerships with entities like European space agencies, maybe securing more contracts with countries like Japan, India, for both space tech and potentially EV tech, too.
Finding new major customers outside the U.S. political sphere. Makes sense. What else?
Localize EV supply chains. The suggestion here is to move more battery and vehicle production operations further offshore. The strategy is to make Tesla less susceptible to U.S.-specific policies or tariffs that could target EVs made domestically, or ones relying on certain supply chains, basically making it harder for U.S. policy to directly impact where and how they build cars.
Okay, insulating production. What's next?
Diplomatic engagement. This means opening back channels, building relationships with more centrist political figures in the U.S., trying to create potential buffers against, extreme swings in policy or inflammatory rhetoric from either side.
Trying to find common ground, or at least some allies, away from the political extremes. Makes sense. And finally,
Rebrand the public narrative. The sources recommend actively emphasizing Tesla's and SpaceX's contributions to domestic job creation, to U.S. innovation leadership.
why that approach?
It's seen as a way to counter that subsidy billionaire narrative we discussed earlier, to highlight the positive economic and strategic impacts these companies actually have within the United States, regardless of the politics.
Those sound like, well, pretty pragmatic steps for navigating a landscape where political alignment, or lack thereof, has become a huge business factor. So, to bring this all together, what's the overarching conclusion the source material reaches about this whole feud?
The conclusion is quite forceful, really. It's that this is no longer just, political drama or some kind of celebrity spat. It's identified as a genuine structural risk, one that directly threatens the operations, the valuations of two of the most influential companies on the planet. Tesla and SpaceX are undeniably caught right in the crossfire.
And it's framed as something bigger than just a business problem, right?
Right. The sources frame it as symptomatic of a broader battle, a battle for the soul of American capitalism, as they put it.
The soul of American capitalism.
Yeah, they describe it as a contest between, on one hand, populist nationalism embodied by Trump's America First industrial agenda, and on the other, techno-entrepreneurial libertarianism, which is often associated with Musk's vision of disruptive, globally focused innovation.
Populist nationalism versus techno-entrepreneurial libertarianism. That's a really compelling framework the sources provide for understanding the deeper forces at play here, underneath all the personal animosity.
And the sources really stress that as the U.S. election cycle continues, and if Trump's legislative agenda potentially takes more concrete shape, Musk's companies face what could be their most defining strategic challenges yet.
Wow, okay. We've really unpacked a lot of layers here, based on the sources you shared. We traced the conflict from its sort of unexpected origins and the specific policy triggers, through the quantifiable damage to Tesla stock and profits, the critical exposure of SpaceX's government contracts, the delays for other ventures.
And even the ripples felt across the broader market and public opinion.
Yeah, and seeing these specific details laid out from the material, it just makes it crystal clear how quickly political dynamics, political rhetoric can transform into really significant financial and operational challenges, even for companies as seemingly untouchable as these.
It's a potent illustration, isn't it? Just how deeply intertwined business and politics have become at the absolute highest levels.
Absolutely. So to leave you, our listener, with a final thought building on everything we've just explored from these sources. Considering this clash, framed as populist nationalism meeting techno-entrepreneurial libertarianism, how might this type of political risk continue to shape the future of innovation in industry? Regardless of which specific figures are involved next time, it's definitely something worth thinking about as you process all this information.